This video will spoil plot elements of Kentucky Route Zero. Expect light spoilers in the first half, nothing that'll ruin the game for you, but just enough to hopefully pique your interest in playing it or give you an idea of the broad tone and themes of the game. I will give a second warning before we get into major plot points and the ending. Kentucky Route Zero is rural cyberpunk. I know. Hey, turn that off. We at Butcher Shark Ltd are interested in what cyberpunk can be, perhaps more so than what it has been or what it is. I praised Mr. Robot in my previous video for its reimagining of cyberpunk in the modern age, or a world on the brink of a proper cyberpunk dystopia. I love the Blade Runner aesthetic as much as the next cyberpunker in a cyberpunker bunker, but I think we can all admit that we largely know what to expect from it. Traditionally, cyberpunk focuses on the large cities. Night City, the sprawl, 2049 Los Angeles, you name it. You may catch glimpses of the world outside of these urban hubs, but not for long. Only as a brief stop-off on the way to more exciting things. These sparsely populated, near-abandoned places feel forgotten, given no more attention than a passing glance out of your backseat car window from the highway, left to gather dust and decompose with time. Aesthetically, Kentucky Route Zero looks a bit different from what you might expect from a traditionally cyberpunk work, and by all means, it's not traditionally cyberpunk. Nor did I think the developers necessarily intended it to be so. But I think if we open our eyes a bit and look past the lack of neon and cybernetics, we'll see that it actually fits the tone and themes of cyberpunk much better than a lot of other works on the market right now, such as Altered Carbon, despite the latter perfectly conforming to the aesthetic expectations of the genre. Many others who have played Kentucky Route Zero remark on how it resembles traditional folk tales, reminiscent of the storytelling style found in the American South or Appalachia. You can't quite remember where the tale left off when you pick it back up again, and certain characters seem to come and go as they please, many fading in and out of relevancy to the story altogether. The art style and music and drip-feed slow pacing culminate in this dreamlike experience that is neither game nor interactive art piece, but somewhere in between. Something that's in a league of its own. This peculiar tone, combined with the long wait in between the release of each act by the developers, result in a peculiar experience for long-term devotees. I was a bit late to the party on this one, I admit. I only got a gaming PC pretty recently, and a large reason I bought it in the first place was specifically to play weird little indie games either not available on or not suited to consoles. So, I started Kentucky Route Zero a couple weeks ago. My long-distance girlfriend had just left an extended stay with me to go be with her family before returning to her school out of state. I was scared to check the mail, knowing that I would find another stern letter from the Department of Student Financial Services, reminding me that I can't continue my education if I don't pay them their pound of flesh, and soon. I, like many others, am stuck on a loop between working a dehumanizing job and returning home to crawl in a hole, unable to leave my apartment for fear of catching a disease that could easily bankrupt me given my lack of health insurance. It often feels scarier to get severely ill and recover than it does to die, because at least you're not in debt when you're dead. I spent about a week alternating the following cycle. Wake up at 4:30 a.m. for work, get home at 3, grab a bottle of gin, and continue down Route Zero in the glow of my LED-lit small apartment bedroom. In contrast to the experience had by others of a long-form episodic story, one told over years with lengthening intermissions, I spent a week-long fever dream playing through this game during a very strange time in my life. The broad strokes are this. Kentucky Route Zero is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Cardboard Computer. It consists of 5 acts and 5 interludes, released one by one over the span of 7 years, ranging from 2013 to 2020. You control your character by clicking on items, people, and dialogue boxes in the environment, and click on the spot on the map you want to walk to. The story is told through a combination of lengthy, non-voice-acted text boxes, along with the environmental storytelling through scenic art direction and flavor text. The game takes place in rural Kentucky, somewhere near the area of Mammoth Cave National Park. You travel an underground highway known only as the Zero, along with an underground river known as the Echo. Kentucky Route Zero has a strong atmosphere that is heavily influenced by the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, magical realism, and Americana. But that doesn't really tell you anything about the game. Even calling it a game feels like a stretch. It's probably far more accurate to describe instead what Kentucky Route Zero feels like to experience, instead of the brass tacks of the moment-to-moment gameplay, and even the story itself. Kentucky Route Zero has the feel of those last hours of those small parties of young adulthood, where you and 3 or 4 others are the last ones up, deliriously sleepy, drunk, or high, swapping stories that range from the hilarious, scary, subdued, and sometimes sad. Where, despite your lack of history with these people, you are all existing in one moment in time, in the hum of a garage or in the still air of an empty backyard, waiting for the sun to come up. You make introductions, but you'll probably never see these people again except maybe in passing. But you'll always remember them. Their faces, if not their names. You'll remember the hat volume music playing on someone's phone, the fruit flies circling abandoned drinks, the unwelcome realization that you have to be at work in a few hours. Kentucky Route Zero feels like going through your grandfather's things the week after he passes away, finding old cassette tapes you listened to when you were a kid. You can't seem to find anything to play them off, though. The Walkman he let you borrow is nowhere to be found, and all you have left is the ghost of the childhood songs and audio dramas to piece together from your memory. The hazy sense of better days, simpler days. Days you aren't sure existed as you remember them, but the cocktail of nostalgia and grief make the memories sweet and ethereal, perhaps better than the real thing ever was. Kentucky Route Zero feels like the swan song of the dying Rust Belt in Appalachia, punctuated with television static and the echoey drip, drip, drip of water in a dark cave. It blends folk gospel, synthwave, ambient noise, and distorted radio signals to create a soundscape I still can't get out of my head. Kentucky Route Zero feels like the story of a people abandoned, left to wither as they are no longer useful to the high-speed, on-demand, dehumanizing forces of late capitalism. They are more useful as debtors than as workers, and their worth in the eyes of the forces that rule their land lies in only their ability to produce or be extracted from. Their value as human beings begins and ends with their profitability. William Gibson once said, "The future has already arrived. It just isn't evenly distributed yet. The characters of Kentucky Route Zero are on the run from the future, seeking out a lost past. As the player's character sets out on his last delivery, he seems to spend far more time reminiscing and remembering than he does planning for a future after that package is dropped off. Kentucky Route Zero seems to be fixated on outdated technology, analog televisions, and old sound equipment. More than one character is obsessed with repairing and reclaiming these technologies. Many of the ghosts that exist within the game exist within these realms of abandoned tech. Ghosts interrupting broadcasts of a dying news show for a dying town. Ghosts on the radio, found within the static that envelops far more airwaves than functioning radio stations. A relatively ancient computer housed within the heart of an ancient mountain, gaining sentience by way of mold going throughout its circuitry, kept alive by the care of an old man who has lost touch with all his loved ones. Even the two primary modes of transportation through the game, Conway's dilapidated truck and the mammoth riverboat that seems to be more of a great wounded beast than a seaworthy vessel, they both break down and require repairs on more than one occasion. Without the humans who have come to care for them and rely on them, these mechanical beings would fade into obscurity along with analog television and AM radio. Two of the most peculiar characters in the game are a pair of android musicians named Johnny and Junebug. Despite being among the few non-human characters in the game, the pair are also among the most compassionate and human characters present. They began their music career after escaping the factory that they were created in and developing a consciousness. Later meeting our growing cast of characters while on their way to a performance, turning around on the highway to help fix the old truck and give the crew shelter and a free show. They serve at times as comedic relief or as a sympathetic ear for the traveler's various woes. The pair have dedicated their lives to performing experimental electronic and synthwave music out of dying truck stop dive bars along the hallway for pennies a performance or for nothing at all. For a game set around Appalachia and the Rust Belt, Kentucky Route Zero contains a whole lot of synthwave. Indeed, it showcases a strange mishmash of retro and high-tech trappings, the same sort of futuristic anachronism, if you will, that you find in most traditionally cyberpunk works. Clunky computers and advanced robots sit side by side. A traditional folk song is shortly interrupted by synthwave ambiance. The truck driver of what seems to be a Ford Model T sports a strange biomechanical limb. Perhaps the most core cyberpunk aspect of Kentucky Route Zero is the ubiquitous presence of the power company, and more broadly, the havoc that late-stage capitalism has wreaked on the area as a whole. You constantly come across mention of a power company, and slowly find that they have all but free reign over the region, and presumably over larger swaths of the area. Debts are consolidated through this power company. They buy up small businesses and take over towns to use as outposts and discard them when convenient. They own mines and distilleries. They provide power in areas where it is profitable, but promptly pull out and abandon entire communities after they have become dependent on the power company's infrastructure, leaving them in the dark and without heat, with minutes of usable power at a time. They transform those indebted to them into literal skeletons of electricity to serve as employees, a brutally straightforward depiction of the modern alienation of the laborer from their work and from their own humanity. It's worth mentioning here that I mix up the power company with other various corporate entities throughout this game, accrediting various actions or results to the power company instead of the specific corporation responsible. However, throughout Kentucky Route Zero, 9 times out of 10, a given corporation is either related to or a subsidiary of the power company, and most debts, regardless to which specific entity, are consolidated through the power company on the debtor's energy bill. Therefore, I do think it's accurate to hold the power company responsible for the actions of their subsidiaries, but it's also important to focus on this as a running theme of corporate consolidation and monopolization. Kentucky Route Zero leaves us wondering about what the world looks like in this version of reality, outside of the branching paths we traveled down Route Zero and the Echo River. We are given bits and pieces of it, but never a bird's eye view of the world outside of the highways and pit stops of Kentucky, the Zero, and the Echo. Kentucky Route Zero is the story of cyberpunk in a rural setting, the parts of America left behind in the dark future. Not coincidentally, many readings of this game take it as a present-day story of rural America with elements of magical realism. I just so happen to think these two readings coexist quite comfortably. The juxtaposition of future with past, along with the overt criticism of capitalism and a neoliberal approach to governance, enable a reading of Kentucky Route Zero which is staunchly in the camp of core cyberpunk, although it may not seem so at first glance due to its non-traditional setting. The aesthetics of neon and massive urban centers can only go so far. A myopic focus on the capital C cyber signifiers of the genre can often miss the point of its core meaning. In his 2015 short essay, Neoliberalism and the Machinery of Disposability, Henry Giraud writes, "What has emerged in this new historical conjecture is an intensification of the practice of disposability, in which more and more individuals and groups are now considered excess, consigned to zones of abandonment, surveillance, and incarceration. Discarded by the corporate state, dispossessed of social provisions, and deprived of the economic, political, and social conditions that enable viable and critical modes of agency, expanding populations of Americans now find themselves inhabiting zones of abandonment marked by deep inequalities in power, wealth, and income. Such zones are sites of rapid divestment, places marked by endless spectacles of violence, and supportive of the neoliberal logics of containment, commodification, surveillance, militarization, cruelty, and punishment." This statement is a distillation of the combined political, economic, and social systems that constitute a modern-day class structure, and the ways in which the interlocking components of those systems are responsible for creating a society in which growing portions of human beings have become a disposable commodity, much like fuel gas, plastic wrappers, or bottles of Hard Times whiskey. Calling Kentucky Route Zero, or cyberpunk as a whole for that matter, an alternate future misses the point, in my eyes. The individual stitches may be different, but the tapestry is the same. Okay, so here's the big one. I'll be spoiling a major plot element of Kentucky Route Zero along with the ending moving forward, so be warned. I leave the choice to carry on to you. In 3, 2, 1. So, we have to talk about Conway. Conway is the first character you play as down the Zero, and you probably assume, as did I, that he will be the protagonist and the player character throughout the entire journey. He's an everyman, an older guy who quit drinking, making his last delivery for a closing antique furniture store. He's got an old dog named Homer or Blue, depending on the player's choice, and you tag along with him as he searches for the route to the elusive 5 Dogwood Drive to make his final delivery. Except he gets hurt. His leg gets crushed while exploring an old mining cave, trying to find his delivery route. He tries to walk it off, but his injury gets worse and worse. His movement gets slower and more labored until he starts passing out from the pain, and he's forced to visit a doctor to get help. During the examination, the doctor offhandedly mentions that he is indebted to the pharmaceutical company that financed his medical education, and he now has a contract with them to pay off that debt. As he starts explaining the payment plan and medical debt consolidation through the power company, both the player and Conway tune out the fine print as the anesthetics take effect. Conway leaves the office walking normally now, briskly, like a young man. In place of his limp, he now has a strange skeletal leg seemingly glowing orange and buzzing with electricity. He and his various companions continue down the Zero and the Echo, making starts and stops as they go, picking up new travelers, and passing the time with stories. They make their way to an abandoned church, and underneath it they find a massive distillery manned by electric skeletons working for the power company. The skeleton man who greets you seems awfully excited to meet Conway and to onboard him for his new job that he'll apparently be starting in the morning. To his companion's confusion, Conway seems to follow along with the glowy skeleton man, or at least not resist. After the tour is over, though, the skeleton man offers Conway a drink of Hard Times whiskey, a tradition for all employees at the start of every shift. In one of the most haunting moments of the game, the player's mouse is slowly dragged to the drink option, leaving the player no choice but to take a sip from the glass. After he drinks, Conway is informed that he is now in even further debt to the power company for the price of the whiskey and his leg, and must report for work in the morning to begin repaying his debt. It dawns on the player that every single skeleton in this damned distillery is in all but name an indentured servant, working themselves to death for an ever-growing debt they can never repay. And he is damned from the moment he drinks from that glass, and he is damned the moment he signed that contract, and he is damned from the moment he hurt his leg. Conway's sobriety and his eventual fall off the wagon as a result of this moment is a recurring theme throughout the game. I couldn't help but feel a little called out as I wallowed in my dark room with my glass of G&T, trying to forget the stress of work and bills and my own debts. The game never outright judges Conway for his drinking, and the player has an option to choose whether or not the characters who interact with him tell him to stop or let him be. The player can also choose exactly how much of an alcoholic Conway is. The presence of alcohol is everywhere throughout the game. The combination of alcohol and debt leads to the downfall of more than one character just like Conway, as seen in the entertainment interlude. Much as with Cyberpunk, Kentucky Route Zero treats substance abuse, alcoholism in particular, as an inevitable result of an anti-human world. Sometimes the bottom of a liquor or pill bottle is all that allows people to cope with the realities of their lives, trapping them in a cycle of addiction and poverty and hopelessness. Conway's companions eventually find out what happened and promptly start trying to forget him while he's still in their presence. Conway begins drinking again with abandon and starts talking to other skeleton distillery boys no one else can see, and his other leg and both his hands turn into glowing bones. Finally, the boys from the distillery come for him in the morning. He is taken away, body turned into an electric flame, transformed into nothing but a source of mechanical motion and production, his entire physical being owned and of the power company. To the rest of the travelers, Conway is as good as dead. He has disappeared, gone, a ghost. They will never see him again. In many stories set in a cyberpunk future, obviously cybernetics play a large role. I find the role of cybernetics interesting not only for their aesthetic and functional qualities, but for the larger implications they have for the bearer. Often a cybernetic limb is purchased and installed out of necessity, a lost limb that must be replaced in order for the person to live and provide for themselves. And more often than not, that limb becomes a debt, a liability. a part of the bearer's physical body that is owned by a corporate entity and steadily accumulating debt and interest that must be repaid. Even the maintenance of the appendage itself becomes a liability. In the cyberpunk horror game Observer, developed by Bloober Team, a plague called the nanophage is most virulent in slums and impoverished communities, the result of a financial inability for bearers of cybernetics to maintain them properly, causing rot, decay, infection, disease, and horrible death. Take the cybernetics and glowy skeleton legs out of the equation, and you can easily see some parallels with our existing healthcare system, especially in the United States or in other countries with a privatized healthcare system. Kickstarters and GoFundMes have become a social media slugfest of who gets enough shares to save their child's life by way of paying for a life-saving medical treatment. Service workers making minimum wage or less escape the brush with death via COVID to spend the rest of their lives paying off hundreds and thousands of medical debt. Kentucky Route Zero makes the real fantastical, using elements of magical realism to draw out the inherent absurdities in how working people are treated. Indentured servitude already exists, in all but name. What else would you call the current labor market? Do you have a choice to go to work when the alternative is being unable to afford food and shelter or pay for life-saving medical treatment? Even the framing of labor as a market betrays the value of human life to the system. Humans are a commodity to be consumed as workers, customers, or debtors. The crux of cyberpunk is the idea that technology won't save us. What meaning do incredible advancements in medical technology have when 99% of us could never afford them, or would be working to pay those unpayable debts for the rest of our lives? How many people can you think of from high school and beyond who disappeared, became absent, or fell off the grid in some way? The phrase carries some levity with it, but in the age of interconnectedness and surveillance, the fate of falling off the grid or losing one's connection is as damning as death itself. It may come as a result of job loss, poverty, addiction, grief, or discrimination, or mental illness. If you lose your car, you're likely going to lose your job unless you can walk there. If you lose your job, you lose your ability to pay rent. If you can't pay rent, you lose your shelter, you lose your permanent address, you can't vote, apply for unemployment, or even have a billing address. You lose your phone line, your internet connection, your ability to contact anyone who could help you. The shame of your situation may do that on its own. You may find yourself picked up by the police for vagrancy or loitering or stealing food. You fall off the grid, fall off the map, lose touch, or fall into the black hole of the carceral system. And eventually, you die alone, on the streets or in prison. This is how you become a living ghost, a specter that never died. You just disappear.
As the years of drought set in and the winds swept the plains as they had always done, the failed crops were not able to fix the soil as the tough prairie grasses once did. A nation watched as the plains blew away.
Ghosts and hauntings are a constant theme throughout the game. Not in the traditional sense where they cause fright, but rather as something to be acknowledged and respected, feared in the biblical sense. Characters hear ghosts on the radio while scanning through dead channels. Ghosts appear in television static on an old analog set. Ghosts of former inhabitants haunt a town destroyed by flood for the umpteenth time. Ghosts of native inhabitants, mine workers, union organizers, and people who are just trying to survive and make a life for themselves in America. These ghosts haunt our protagonists, but benignly. Their presence is a reminder that those who have died are not gone, so long as traces of them exist in the world, in our collective memories, or in old cassettes. They are also a reminder that a person doesn't necessarily have to die to become a ghost. Places can be haunted as well. No disaster nor death need occur to make it so, and regardless of whether any literal ghosts are present. Think of those subreddits and blogs devoted to cataloging the bizarre eeriness of abandoned shopping malls or industrial buildings, or consider the traditional meaning of the phrase ghost town. It's usually an abandoned mining or manufacturing town that withered and died when the company invested in them pulled out, having bled the land and its inhabitants dry. There is a telephone operator who works beside an underground river. She used to be one of more than a dozen employees, happily chatting away on breaks between calls. The power company began to automate the system, letting each employee go one by one until only the last remained. She works alone, in the dark, only pushing buttons to train her AI counterpart how to do her job so the power company can replace her as well. There's an entire bureau that's dedicated to reclaiming destroyed and abandoned spaces. Whether this bureau is corporate or government operated is also not so clear, as sometimes the two entities seem to be one and the same. Also, there are bears on the 4th floor. No, literally, there are just bears on the 4th floor doing bear shit. These reclaimed places are converted into centers of production. A church made a distillery, a school to a power plant, or a graveyard to a factory. It's not a coincidence that these places being reclaimed were once centers of humanity and community, often free of charge, and have now been turned into gears of the corporate mechanisms often responsible for their destruction. And they'll likely be abandoned just a few decades down the road. From Giroux. The plight of disposable populations can be seen in the fact that millions of Americans are unemployed and receiving no long-term benefits. Shockingly, the only source of assistance for 1 in 50 Americans is nothing but a food stamp card. Close to half of all Americans live on or beneath the poverty line, while more than 1 million public school students are homeless in the United States. 57% of all children are in homes considered to be either low income or impoverished, and half of all American children will be on food stamps at least once before they turn 18 years old. At the same time, the richest 400 Americans have as much wealth as 154 million Americans combined. That's 50% of the entire country, while the top economic 1% of the population has a record 40% of all wealth and more wealth than 90% of the population combined. After finishing Kentucky Route Zero, I've been perpetually obsessed with the soundtrack by Ben Babbit and its inclusion of haunting synthwave and stirring folk music. The kind of music that evokes the feeling of walking home from work after the sun has set, seeking shelter from the rain. Listening to the soundtrack, I was reminded of Woody Guthrie, you know, the American folk legend who lived through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and hopped trains and walked from Oklahoma to California and back again to provide for his family, who had the phrase, "This machine kills fascists," plastered on his guitar. And I was thinking about the ending lyrics to his song, Lindbergh.
So I'm gonna tell you people, if Hitler's gonna be beat, common working people has got to take the seat in Washington, Washington. And I'm gonna tell you workers, before you cash in your checks, they say America first, but they mean America next in Washington, Washington.
I'm of the opinion that folk was the original punk. Hot take, I know. But folk music was written by and for ordinary people, working people of all colors, shapes, and sizes. Many of the most well-known American folk songs are credited as anonymous, with their lyrics sung over 100 years, from hobo camp to factory floor, evolving and being written by entire communities over time. An Appalachian, Dust Bowl, Rust Belt version of the great oral legends of Homer or of the African diasporas. Folk music are just tall tales set to music. To borrow the words of Woody Guthrie once more, I hate a song that makes you think you're not any good. I hate a song that makes you think you are just born to lose, bound to lose. No good to nobody, no good for nothing. Because you are either too old or too fat or too young or too slim or too ugly or too this or too that. Songs that run you down and songs that poke fun of you on account of your bad luck or your hard traveling. I am out to fight those kinds of songs to my very last breath of air and my very last drop of blood. Folk music was also heavily influenced by gospel and hymnals. Many songs lamenting the radical love of the Christian Jesus, as seen through the eyes of the kind of people he is said to have preached to and for. A constant theme of folk is that of the long, hard journey, one of pain and suffering and loneliness, but a journey that must be undertaken in order to reach home, a better home, far away from this place.
Not my home, oh Lord. What will I do? Angels beckon me to heaven's open door, and I can feel at home in this world anymore.
They're making it look like it is a standard value of Americans. And we say to corporate greed, it will not stand today, it will not stand tomorrow, and it will not stand in the future.
The rich abusing the poor isn't new. Lack of upwards mobility isn't new. Zones of abandonment aren't new. The future has already arrived. It just hasn't been evenly distributed yet. That quote runs both ways. Typically, it is attributed to certain types of advanced technologies being available in some areas or to some classes, but not others. I'd like to postulate that huge segments of both America and the world are already living in our conception of a cyberpunk dystopia. The difference being they can't just afford a new cybernetic leg in cash if their flesh and blood version gets crushed. Like Conway, they pay with their lives. I see Kentucky Route Zero as the other side of the cyberpunk coin, or a credit chip? We're all too familiar with the sprawling urban hells of Gibson, Pondsmith, Stevenson, and Dick. Kentucky Route Zero gives us a glance into those places off-screen and off-page, deemed not interesting enough. It tells the stories of those living in places abandoned by their governments, capital, and even the land itself. It's the Dust Bowl of the dark future. At the end of Kentucky Route Zero, the band of travelers make Conway's final delivery in his stead, now that he's become a ghost. They reach their destination, a town wiped out by a cataclysmic flood the night before, a direct result of the power company's negligence to fix the proper drainage sloping previously eroded by their use and subsequent discarding of the land as a mining outpost. As the inhabitants of the town leave for good, abandoning their destroyed homes, the travelers of Route Zero stay and decide to start a new life with what is left. They refuse to abandon their new home or search for a better life, some of them leaving a previously steady, if soul-crushing job. The final decision of the travelers is an act of rebellion, a choice to live outside of the system despite knowing that it will be a hard life, despite knowing that at any moment another great flood could come crashing down and wipe away everything they've built. But nevertheless, they choose freedom and companionship over the illusion of security and normalcy offered by the power company and their ilk. Better to live and die with friends you trust than slave for a company who will abandon you the moment you are no longer profitable and leave you to die alone anyways. Now tell me that's not cyberpunk as fuck.
I've heard of a land of joy and peace and wonderful life, a beautiful place of mansions fair and skies so bright, where all who believe the Savior dear forever shall stay. And having been saved by grace divine, I'm going that way. I'm going that way. I'm going that way. Yes, dear, the Savior I adore is with me each day. I'm clinging to Him and never to stray, just singing praises all day long. I'm going that way. Well, glorious news I tell and sing as onward I go. For those who are still astray in sin, my Savior may know. I want them to sing that praise above some beautiful day. For glory to Him who died for me, I'm going that way. I know I shall meet Him at the gate when trials are past. I know I shall meet Him face to face in glory at last. Oh, I believe that when we meet, well done, He'll say. While trusting my soul redeeming love, I'm going that way. I'm going that way. I'm going that way. Yes, dear, the Savior I adore is with me each day. I'm clinging to Him and never to stray, just singing praises all day long. I'm going that way.
Hey y'all, thanks so much for making it to the end of this long ass video. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the support that I've gotten so far. It means a lot to me. I don't care if 2 people watch these videos, but somebody else is interested, hell yeah, that makes me happy. So yeah, thank you. Stay safe, drink water. Let me know in the comments if there is anything in particular that you want me to cover or want to see me talk about. Peace out.